Hello, I'm Andreas Blum, parish priest to the German-speaking Catholic parish of St. Boniface in London.
And I'm Barbara Höfling, singer and director of the German Choir of London. Welcome to our podcast on theology and music.
Christianity begins with the story of the Passion, with horror and grief at the violent death of a human being. But many people crossed Jesus' path of suffering, whether indifferent, reluctant, powerless, compassionate, faithful or supportive.
In words and music, we want to try to put ourselves in the place of these people and look at where they touch our own lives, these minor figures in the biblical Passion story.
It is Friday in Jerusalem. The city is even more crowded than usual. Numerous pilgrims have arrived for the imminent Passover festival. The streets are bustling and noisy, as many people still have last-minute errands to run before the Sabbath begins at nightfall. In the midst of the crowd is the group that has set out to crucify Jesus. It has to make its way from the Praetorium, Pilate's official residence, across the city to Golgotha. But in the narrow streets there is hardly room to get through. Jesus has to carry the crossbeam for his crucifixion on his own shoulders to the place of execution. Again and again the troop of soldiers shoves him along. Some of his disciples also follow in despair. Many people, however, will have paid the cruel spectacle little attention, and if they did look, it was probably just briefly and with a shrug of the shoulders, for they had grown up with the brute force the Romans used to secure their rule and had been used to it for decades. But there are also some women who weep and lament for Jesus. We do not know their names, and perhaps it's best if we don't. For the women and their distress could well represent all of us who are confronted with this terrible story of suffering and don't want just to go on our way unmoved. That way, they could keep a place for us, so I could join the crowd who watch from the side of the road and who react in the only way that a human should, by weeping and bemoaning the murder of an innocent man. Only, the more I identify with the weeping women, the harder it hits me how Jesus reacted to them. It's almost a recurring theme throughout the Bible. Again and again we hear, from the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament to the revelation of John in the New, the Lord God will wipe away tears from off all faces. Jesus himself picks up the motive with one of his Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted. We could be justified in assuming then that Jesus would somehow be able to comfort the weeping women in spite of everything, perhaps giving them hope that things would turn out well in the end, or that he at least would be grateful for their compassion and sympathy. Instead, however, he bluntly holds up a mirror to them. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep rather for yourselves and for your children. And in an almost cynical sounding twist, he now says that they will be blessed who are barren and haven't suckled a child. For everyone will wish that they and their children had died, rather than having to go through what lay before them. At first, this sounds like the angry cursing of someone who sees his life in ruins, who feels that he and his teaching have failed, who now takes back his promise and says instead, "You don't deserve God's comfort at all. Woe to you." From a purely human point of view, that would be understandable for anyone facing martyrdom. But the harsh words hit exactly the wrong people. How can the crying women help it? After all, they are on the right side. And can we imagine Jesus being allowed just to stand still, and his finding the strength to draw morals too? Hardly. What we see here is a carefully composed piece of teaching that the evangelist Luke put together many years after Jesus' death, at a time when what Jesus had only vaguely spoken of had long since become a bitter reality. By then, the Romans had destroyed and plundered the temple. They had torn out the dwelling place of God, the heart of Jerusalem, enslaved many of her inhabitants, and deported them to all parts of their empire. For Luke, then, Jesus' harsh word is not so much a curse or a threat as an attempt to interpret the great catastrophe retrospectively. Only if it's deliberately meant as a lesson for future generations, what exactly is the way Jesus treats the weeping women supposed to teach me? My teacher in primary school, Miss Lorek, taught me not only to read and write, but also to pray. and when we heard a siren or an emergency bugle in class, we had to pause for a moment and, with her, think of the people in need and the people helping them, and say a short prayer for all of them. For a long time, I took that practice very seriously, until I thought to myself, what's the point? That doesn't help anyone. I might as well stop. It makes no difference. What I only understood much later was that, above all, these prayers did something to me, for they forced me to think about the people who needed help, whom I couldn't see, but who are always there. Very early on, these prayers brought my small and generally intact world into contact with the world in which people stand by each other, where, if one lot of people can no longer help, others step in, and where, when no one can help anymore, there is still a God. This perspective beyond my own backyard was and is important. It keeps me from thinking only about myself and leaving the rest of the world to its own devices. It's only if I know about it, if I let it touch me, that I can also recognize the situations where I am needed and can help. God doesn't need our prayers, just as He doesn't need the tears of the weeping women. Instead, He refers us back to our own world, which offers enough reason to weep and enough hardship for us to tackle. My sympathy, my compassion, and my tears are important, not if I pat myself on the back for being sensitive, but if they are the first step and an impetus for concrete help. Because the suffering of others is my business too. It is never far away. Sooner or later, its consequences will rebound on me. In my own interest, my tears can only ever be a beginning.